In a lot of ways, it's hardly surprising there is a lot of university folklore. People are away from home, often for the first time, in a strange environment with a lot of new places. They're also often in old buildings where who only knows what has happened in the past. So it's easy for unusual stories to emerge. For example, Karen told me about a red room on the Michigan State University campus, and I quote, that had been the site of nefarious doings and was locked down to keep out looky-loos, end quote. And the stone lions outside McMicken Hall at the University of Cincinnati apparently growl at night. Some people actually think they only do so if a cheetah or a virgin passes them. But ghosts certainly make up a large proportion of the stories about universities, especially in the UK. So let's take a look at some university folklore, including myths about failing your exams, in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I have to admit, when I decided to do schools last week, I honestly didn't think that schools were going to be in the UK headlines quite as much as they have been. But we are moving on to universities with this particular week's episode. As with the school folklore post, I have included examples of folklore from primary sources because I did ask if anyone had any stories from their university on social media, and I've collected most of the answers that I got. Some of them weren't necessarily, again, in the kind of ballpark of what I was looking for, but there was a lot fewer of them compared to the schools. So schools definitely seem to have more going on with them. So as a result, I've then had to supplement the stories with ones that I found in secondary sources. Now, also, I am aware that last October, the Knowledge Academy published research, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, that named the top 10 supposedly most haunted universities in the UK. And while quite a lot of articles were published around the time by the universities in question being like, ooh, look at us, we've been named, da, da, da. I'm like, you know what, I'm going to deliberately disregard it because of the flawed methodology. So if you haven't seen the research, what they did was they looked at how many cemeteries were near the university, how many headstones those cemeteries had, how many listed buildings were in a given radius, I think it was 2 miles, and how many paranormal reports occurred within 2 miles of the university, and also like when the thing achieved listed status, which is nonsense. And as a result, you ended up with like Newcastle University was 10th, and the ghost stories that they listed in the post about it have nothing to do with the university. And indeed, I can't find anyone with any ghost stories about Newcastle University itself. And I'm just like, you've basically just picked where a haunted place is and then said, oh, the university there must be haunted as well. So I'm not including that because that is just a really, really flawed approach to it. So here I've stuck to ghost stories about the buildings because the focus of this episode is folklore associated with the institution, which is largely comprised of the physical space. And I should point out as well, if you're hoping for discussion of the now infamous Room 611 in Allenbrook Hall at Queen's University in Belfast, I am going to disappoint you because the Uncanny podcast has obviously done a lot better job of exploring that, and I think it's probably just going to be easier for you to have a look at their episodes instead, and there is a link in the show notes. But we are going to get cracking with the ghosts part because there are more of them, and we're going to have a look at a few examples of potentially former residents. So Graham told me about the old main building of the University of Wales at the Caerleon campus. Apparently a maid fell over a staircase rail from the top floor, and her ghost continued to roam the building. And as Graham explained, and I quote, you could actually see where a higher section of rail had been welded onto the lower original metal, end quote. Now that particular campus closed in July 2016, and there's been a fair bit of wrangling over what they're going to do with the site, so who knows what she's doing now. Meanwhile, Mike told me about Lincoln College Library in Oxford, and All Saints Church on Turl Street closed in 1971 and reopened in 1976 as Lincoln College Library. And they removed the bodies in the crypt to make way for a basement library. And as Mike told me, and I quote, for some months afterwards, books in the area would be mysteriously moved and left on the floor overnight when the building was locked, end quote. Obviously, I don't know how long that went on for, and I don't know if it still happens now. If you do know, If things do still get moved around in the basement library at Lincoln College Library, then as always, please do let me know. But finally, Aaron at the Appalachian Folklore podcast told me a story from his time at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. And as he told it, one night his then girlfriend woke up to see a sopping wet woman standing by her bedside. She figured it must have been the young woman who, and I quote, drowned in the basement of her dorm building because a pipe burst while she was down there doing laundry, end quote. And she wasn't the only one to have seen this person, because her roommate and friend had similar experiences. Now, this all happened in Coons Hall, spelled Koonce, which Aaron believed was named after the girl who died. Now, it turns out that the building is the only hall at the university named after a student, named for Judith E. Coons and dedicated in 1968. However, Judith didn't die in the basement. She actually graduated in 1957 with a BSc in education, and in 1958 she was working as a summer camp counsellor. A child fell into the Little Miami River, and while Judith jumped in to mount a rescue, the powerful current overwhelmed her, and the university renamed the building in honour of Judith's bravery. So this particular story, it does involve water, and it does involve the person that the hall is named after, but kind of why the building's named after her, and the link with water is obviously very, very different. So it would be quite interesting, because there's nothing actually saying that if people were seeing a sopping wet woman, that it wasn't the ghost of Judith A. Coons, but it's just the fact that why she was in the building is obviously a very different reason from what the legend seems to claim. There's also Farley Hall at the University of Mississippi, which stands on the site of the old dead house demolished in 1958, and obviously there's an entire episode on dead houses if you're interested. But this previous building acted as a morgue to house war dead before these people were buried at the Civil War cemetery across the campus. And Christina Stoib notes local anecdotes in which people claim to encounter ghostly presences in the area, but unfortunately no one knows if they're Civil War victims or long dead students. And I wanted to go on to Roehampton University, where I actually did my MA. And if you've never heard of it, I hadn't either. And it's in London, and it's basically, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe where Roehampton is. It's kind of just to the northeast of Richmond Park. So it's kind of in between Richmond Park and Putney is the best kind of place of trying to describe where on earth it is. And if you don't know London very well, it's kind of southwest of everything else. If you are familiar with John Dee at all, it's just down the road from Mortlake, but there we go. But there were always rumours of ghosts in Digby Stuart, which was one of the really big buildings on the main campus. Now, I hadn't really fully appreciated when I went there that Roehampton's actually comprised of 4 colleges. So Digby Stuart as a building is actually Digby Stuart College, and it was founded by the Society of the Sacred Heart Sisters in 1874 to train women as teachers. Now, I must admit, I was there in sort of 2004 to 2005, and there was an upstairs corridor near the film lecturer's offices, which always had a really eerie atmosphere. And a lecturer once told me about hearing ghostly piano music late at night in the building, and he'd had a bit of a weird experience when he was there late one night, but I can't remember the details, which is kind of annoying. So that's all I can remember about that one. But I was quite shocked to learn while I was researching this episode that 119 bodies are apparently buried on the main campus. I'm going to assume that they're somehow supposed to be there, because otherwise that would be a lot of people to kind of misplace. But the main reason why I've mentioned Roehampton is one of the other colleges is Whitelands, and it's actually situated further down Roehampton Lane beyond Danebury Avenue, and sort of basically just as you get to Richmond Park. And in 1979, historian Joan P. Alcock actually wrote an account of the weird unexplained activity in Parkstead House, the main building at Whitelands. Now, I have actually included a picture of this in the blog post, and it's also in the YouTube video as well, because I think that you'll find it more useful to actually see what it looks like, to be like, why would this building be so haunted? It genuinely looks like a house out of Pride and Prejudice. It's weird. But in the early 1960s, workmen actually refused to work in parts of the building during alterations after dark. And a student apparently once heard footsteps pass by him and then along a corridor, which would have been fine if access to that particular corridor hadn't been blocked by a partition, so there should have been no way for the person to sort of get past and continue walking. Lecturers reported feeling unseen figures brush by them in the corridors, to the extent one guy actually reported moving out the way, convinced he was going to collide with someone, and then realising he was the only one in the corridor. Another lecturer said that he entered his classroom and he saw a berobed figure get up and move across the room, which really would put the wind up anybody, I think, really. One of the domestic staff had apparently laid out coffee in room 1 early one morning, and she left the room to go and get something else. And then she was like, oh no, did I bring the sugar? Went back to check, and when she came back in, the table had been overturned and there were piles of magazines spread across the floor. And it seems that room 1 and the science laboratory were really popular areas for activity. Now, Alcock actually brought a visitor to the college who then asked what happened in a top floor room of the main building due to its atmosphere, because this person apparently felt sure something awful had happened in the centre of the room. And most tellingly, a caretaker reported that his dog flat out refused to enter certain parts of the building and would start kind of growling and snarling and all that kind of jazz if he was made to go in any of these places. So really, like, I think you all know me well enough by now to kind of think, well, yes, all my lectures took place in Southlands College, the one that looked like a leisure centre, but you just know that I wish that I'd gone down to Whitelands for a look, having heard all of this. So if you have been a student at Roehampton University and been to Whitelands and know what I'm talking about, then again, please do feel free to get in touch. But even top universities aren't spared from supernatural shenanigans, and Cambridge University, no less, boasts a few ghosts among its legends. And both staff and students at Christ's College report disembodied voices and footsteps along with cold spots. And a male ghost apparently circles a tree near the swimming pool at midnight on the full moon, and he's believed to be Christopher Round. Now, according to the legend, Round began an affair with Mary Clifford, who was also the lover of Philip Collier, one of Round's friends. So one night, Round and Collier, who at this point are still friends, got absolutely steaming drunk, and Collier fell into the swimming pool. Now, Round decided to just let him drown, because then that would mean he could have Clifford all to himself, and he just left him there. And once sober, Round's actions haunted him for the rest of his life, and apparently it's him that's supposed to then wander around this tree, kind of wishing that he could take back the events of that night. Meanwhile, Corpus Christi College's most famous ghost is Dr. Henry Butts, and he was the college physician during the 17th century, and he actually looked after the sick during a plague outbreak in the early 1630s, and many people actually credited his actions with keeping the death toll lower than it might have otherwise been. Unfortunately, Butts also suffered from depression, and he ended up taking his own life in 1632. Now, students actually attempted to exorcise Butts in 1904, and weirdly, that wasn't actually for their benefit, it was for his, because they actually wanted to free him so that he could finally sort of find peace. But people still report seeing him now, so the exorcism obviously didn't work. And some people also think that the bodiless ghost of none other than Oliver Cromwell himself patrols the grounds at Sydney Sussex College. Now, his head allegedly rests here, and people think he's looking for his body, which was buried elsewhere. And meanwhile, some people report seeing the headless ghost of Charles I at Christ Church College, also in Cambridge. So you kind of wonder what would happen if the two of them ever got together. But there we go. Now, our final category relates to failed exams, or the fear of failing them, which is obviously quite an understandable worry while you're at university. And I think that's probably why I could find at least two things related to this, one more famous than the other, because, so pervasive is the fear of this. Now, Heather told me a legend of an exam curse from the University of Birmingham, and apparently, and I quote, "If you pass through the arches of the clock tower in the middle of the main campus at midnight," end quote, "then you would fail your exams." So that one's actually quite an easy one to avoid. But the one at Royal Holloway University of London is a lot more difficult to avoid because it's got a long-running urban legend associated with failing exams. And it's all related to a painting. And I have put this specific painting in the video on YouTube, but exactly at this point. So if you're listening, make sure you have a look. But it's also in the blog post as well. So again, you can also have a look if you want to see it. And it's Sir Edwin Landseer's painting, Man Proposes, God Disposes, which hangs at Royal Holloway. And it depicts two polar bears tearing at the remains of a ship and its passengers. Now, Landseer took inspiration from the disappearance of Sir John Franklin in 1845 while trying to chart the Northwest Passage. It's not the most cheerful painting I've ever seen. I've seen worse, don't get me wrong, but it's not a particularly cheerful painting at all. And as the myth runs, anyone who sits in front of it during an exam will fail. Now, it's quite difficult to pinpoint the start of the myth, but the painting has been associated with exams since they began there in the 1920s. So really, because it's related to failing exams, it could kind of only really have started when exams did. So I think we can probably date it to the 1920s. But the myth continued for like another 50 years. So by the 1970s, students so feared the painting that one particular student just absolutely refused point blank to be seated beside it in an exam. The registrar was like, I'm just going to have to cover the painting, aren't I? And they found the biggest thing available to cover the painting so that they could get the exam underway. And it was a huge Union flag, which saved the day and covers the painting during exams even now. And I'm calling it the Union flag because apparently it's only the Union Jack if it's at sea. Yes, it's a whopping great flag hanging like basically laid over this painting during exams so that people will sit next to it. But the myth has changed slightly since the university started covering the painting, because in one particular adaptation, a student apparently lost their mind and killed themselves right there in the exam hall after looking directly into one of the bear's eyes. Now, reports conflict as to who the student was or indeed how they ever actually did it, because it never happened. So the curator reported here in the story involving a male student, but also a female student, and they'd heard like 3 different ways that it apparently happened. And again, as I say, it just didn't. But it's interesting how this myth seems to have such staying power. So it's already evolved once. Who knows how it'll evolve in future. But of course, not all urban legends are malevolent. And I particularly like this one from Marissa, which comes from Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And as the legend ran, and I quote, unemployed English majors or some other supposedly useless humanities degree would be given the choice to come back to campus and be reincarnated as squirrels after 5 years, end quote. And as she noted, the campus had a lot of squirrels. And I quite like that one because, I mean, as somebody who's done 2 supposedly useless humanities degrees and is now doing a PhD in the humanities, there's part of me kind of thinks like, actually, yeah, I can see why you would sort of, if you had a bit of a beef with the idea of people doing those and you'd be like, oh, you'll never get a job with that, and you go, oh, you'd come back and be reincarnated as a squirrel then, because there's lots on campus. I just thought that was really funny. But I do think this story helps to illustrate the motivation behind some of the folklore, because obviously some stories relate to features of the campus, whether that's statues, squirrels, paintings, hidden rooms, steam tunnels, all that kind of thing. They appear in different stories in different ways. And I suppose people might see these things often and either not really know what's going on with them, or particularly locked doors, or eventually the folklore just becomes associated with them over time. And I think that the Royal Holloway cursed painting myth is actually quite a good example of an urban legend in action, which then evolves to incorporate new elements. Though the ghosts may also serve a slightly different purpose, and Dan told me one about SUNY Cortland, which is one of the most haunted universities in New York State. And in May 2022, the Introduction to Public History class revealed the results of their research project into the stories of hauntings on campus. Now, the students had dug through the archives and discovered that none of the incidents behind any of these supposed sightings were actually linked to factual records. So, as one particular example, there was this ghost linked with a particular room, but that room didn't actually exist, and so on. So those kind of stories. But many of these stories popped up in the 1980s, which was the same time that the counselling centre started offering emotional support. And the class found, and I quote, the campus community responded to all these reports of supernatural visions by assisting any students who might be struggling with mental health issues or are survivors of sexual assault or violence in a relationship, end quote. And the students basically discovered how the ghost stories went on to help the university more aware of issues on campus, but also better able to deal with them as well. And perhaps the other ghost stories perform a similarly therapeutic function. So they can create a space in which students can share warnings to others, they can share their concerns without directly expressing them, if that makes sense. But of course, there is always the other alternative that sometimes students just really like to scare each other. So it could be either or, it could be a bit of one, bit of the other. Who knows? If you would like to share any of your university folklore with me, because obviously you've had a flavour of the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, you can obviously quote on the YouTube video, or you can quote on the blog post that this episode is attached to, or you can tweet me, message me on Blue Sky, Threads, whatever. I'm kind of pretty much everywhere. So I'm sure you can find me on some platform that you're using. And I'm Icy Sedgwick on like everything, so you should be able to find me quite easily, which is helpful. Next week, I think we're possibly going to do hospitals. I don't know why, I just feel like that would be a good one. I'm also planning on prisons, but then I'm stuck for the last one between libraries or museums because they're both institutions. So if you want to let me know what your preference is, and I can sort of pick one or the other, because I don't really want to put them together because I think I'm going to probably end up with quite a lot. Anyway, I'm rambling now. Let me know what you'd prefer between either of those two things, and that would be brilliant. I was very pleased to announce that Rebel Folklore came out on Thursday just gone, well, like literally 2 days ago. So if you are in the UK, and I think Europe, you should have your copies now if you pre-ordered. So it's lovely to see photos of people reading them, or just when they've turned up. So I got like so many brilliant photos of people reading them on the bus and reading them on the train, or people just like enjoying them with their kids and so on. So if you have actually got a copy of Rebel Folklore, again, please feel free to send me a picture or tag me in it on Instagram, because it's really lovely to kind of sort of see where it's ended up, if that makes sense. It's always really great to see. But I hope you have an absolutely marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.